Injustice. Emily Turner's story didn't begin with tragedy. Born and raised in a small Midwestern town, she carried the values of honesty, integrity, and resilience, instilled by hardworking parents. Emily's life changed when she met David Riley at the university. David, the eldest son of the ultra-wealthy Riley family, was charming yet reserved, already burdened by the weight of expectations. Their whirlwind romance surprised both worlds, Emily's modest background clashing with the grandeur and subtle snobbery of David's old money family. Marriage was not a mere union of two people, but of two worlds. The Riley estate in upstate New York, with its manicured gardens and grand halls, stood in stark contrast to everything Emily had ever known. From the beginning, she felt out of place, every dinner conversation, every family gathering, subtly reminding her of the hierarchy she'd supposedly upset. The Riley matriarch, Margaret, made veiled comments about class and breeding. Emily's only solace was her daughter, Sophie, a bright-eyed child whose laughter brought warmth to the coldest corners of the mansion. It was in this gilded cage that the scandal took root. One crisp autumn morning, Emily woke to a changed world. A series of anonymous photos circulated online, purporting to show her in suspiciously intimate situations with a family friend. The evidence was fabricated, but in the world of the Rileys, even a hint of dishonor was enough to trigger disaster. Overnight, Emily was cast as the villain, a seductress, an ingrate, someone unworthy of the Riley name. David, torn between love and duty, grew cold and distant. He stopped defending her at family meetings. The staff, who once smiled politely, now whispered as she passed by. Emily's protests fell on deaf ears. Her every attempt at explanation was drowned out by accusation and scorn. The Riley family's inner circle closed ranks, phasing Emily out of family events, hinting that her very presence now threatened their reputation. The worst blow came not from public shame, but from private betrayal. In closed-door meetings ostensibly for the family's protection, the Rileys pressed for divorce. In the process, they leveraged every legal and financial tool to strip Emily of her rights. With the family's influence looming over the court, custody of Sophie was wrenched from her. That moment, watching her daughter's terrified face as she left the mansion, seared itself into Emily's memory. Alone and vilified, Emily was forced to leave the only home her daughter had ever known. Friends from her old life were too intimidated to offer support, fearing the Riley power and legal threats. Even in her hometown, gossip followed. She rented a small apartment in an unfamiliar city, her savings depleted by costly legal battles. Nights were the hardest. The silence magnified her grief, her anger, and a growing resolve. One thing was clear: she would survive, not simply out of instinct, but for Sophie. Though the world had branded her with shame, Emily clung to her truth, her innocence, and the unbreakable bond with her child. As fall faded into winter, Emily began to rebuild, quietly gathering the fragments of her shattered confidence. She knew she had been wronged. She vowed, in the cold solitude of her new life, that injustice would not define her future. This was not just the end of a marriage, but the beginning of a long road, one she would walk with determination, in pursuit of dignity, justice, and above all, her daughter. Starting over. When Emily closed the door to her new cramped apartment for the first time, the finality struck her with unexpected force. Her entire life now fit in several battered suitcases and a handful of cardboard boxes. The rooms were bare, the wallpaper faded, and the only sounds were the distant hum of city traffic and the echoing emptiness of solitude. It was a far cry from the opulence of the Riley estate, but for Emily, it signified something terrifying and exhilarating: the chance to begin again. The days after her departure from the Rileys blurred together in a haze of grief and survival. Emily spent the first night sprawled on a borrowed mattress, the ache of Sophie's absence pressing against her chest. Every object, Sophie's forgotten toy, a stray hair ribbon, rekindled memories and reminded her of all she had lost. She called her daughter at every scheduled opportunity, clinging to those brief guarded conversations as her lifeline. Sophie's voice, hesitant and confused, buoyed her spirit, even as each call ended too quickly under the watchful eye of the Riley family. Financial reality soon made itself known. Legal fees had gutted Emily's savings. The prestigious university degree she had earned took on new meaning. She was now just another single mother, caught in the machinery of survival. Emily pounded the pavement for work, traveling across the city clutching a folder of carefully prepared resumes. Rejection was frequent and often tinged with unspoken judgment. Her last name carried notoriety in more circles than she realized. Employers who once would have courted the wife of David Riley now hesitated to even grant her an interview. Unwilling to yield, Emily took whatever work she could find. She waited tables at a noisy downtown diner, where the hours were long, the tips sparse, and the clientele indifferent. In the evenings, she enrolled in night classes, determined to upgrade her skills and regain the confidence shattered by public humiliation. The classroom became her refuge, a place where she could blend in, reinvent herself, and nurture the faint embers of ambition that refused to die. Loneliness was her most persistent adversary. Her parents, supportive but aging and fearful of Riley reprisals, kept their distance for safety's sake. Old friends drifted away. Some could not bear the association, while others simply did not know what to say. Even neighbors in her building, sensing her fragility, offered only polite nods. Emily learned to be alone. She spent hours walking the city streets, finding solace in the anonymity that once intimidated her. With time, she discovered quiet pleasures, reading late into the night, sunrise jogs through the park, coffee from a cheap corner stand that reminded her of simpler days. Yet hardship bred unexpected growth. Faces in the city, an exhausted single father from her building, an immigrant classmate juggling 3 jobs, a retired librarian at the public library, became threads in a new, hard-won support network. Emily found herself drawn not to power or luxury, but to resilience and kindness. These small alliances soothed her isolation and reinforced a powerful truth. She was not completely alone, and she was far stronger than the Rileys, or even she herself had ever believed. Still, the absence of Sophie was a wound that refused to heal. Emily marked every missed milestone with a silent ache. Birthdays, school recitals, nights when Sophie called crying, and Emily could offer nothing but words. Instead of succumbing to resentment, Emily channeled her pain into purpose. She kept meticulous records of every call, every encounter with the Riley lawyers, every promise made and broken. Each setback became another stone in her foundation, a reminder of what was at stake, and for whom she was fighting to rebuild. Through the changing of seasons, Emily endured setbacks and celebrated modest victories. A promotion at work, a glowing grade in her courses, a letter from Sophie, carefully slipped through the cracks of the Riley vigilance, filled with childlike affection and hope. Step by step, Emily pieced together a new life, not a return to the past, but the gradual emergence of a woman tempered by adversity. As winter thawed into spring, Emily looked out over the city she now called home, her resolve hardening. She was shaping not only her future, but Sophie's as well. For the sake of her daughter and for her own redemption, Emily would persevere. Starting over, she realized, was not merely an act of survival, but the first act in reclaiming everything she and Sophie had been denied. Healing and rising little by little, Emily Turner began to reconstruct her life from the ruins of heartbreak and hardship. The years of scraping by, endless rejection, and the ache of Sophie's absence had forged a resilience she never knew she possessed. What had begun as a daily struggle for survival slowly crystallized into a clear, unwavering resolve. She would not simply endure, she would rise. Emily's decision to return to school had planted the first seeds of hope. After months attending night classes, she discovered a dormant passion for the law, inspired by her own battle with the justice system. Every lecture and case study lit a fire inside her. The law, she realized, could be both a sword and a shield. For a woman who had lost so much to legal maneuvering and manipulation, Reclaiming knowledge was a way to regain control, and one day, to fight for herself and for others like her. Her classmates were as varied as the city itself. Young parents, war veterans, dreamers from faraway states and countries. To Emily, their shared determination was a balm. They connected over late-night study sessions, stories of perseverance, and commiserations about exhausting jobs. At the heart of these connections, Emily found genuine friendships, ones independent of social status and family background. For the first time in years, laughter and camaraderie replaced some of the emptiness at her core. Financial burdens still weighed heavily. Emily juggled class assignments with work, often collapsing into bed just before dawn. Sometimes she questioned whether the sacrifices would ever yield fruit. But each time doubt crept in, she reminded herself of why she was fighting, not just for a career, but for the chance to stand tall again, and one day reclaim her place as a mother, fully and proudly. Emily's tenacity caught the attention of a professor, Miss Alvarez, who became an unexpected mentor. Recognizing Emily's sharp mind and burning sense of justice, Miss Alvarez suggested she intern at a legal aid clinic. There, Emily encountered the city's silent suffering. Tenants threatened with eviction, single mothers like herself drowning in bureaucracy, immigrants intimidated by daunting processes. Empathy and anger mingled as Emily guided clients through paperwork and listened to their stories. Their gratitude was transformative. It healed some invisible wound inside her, reminding her that she still had worth, and more importantly, purpose. Sophie remained the axis around which her world spun. Although contact was limited and always supervised, Emily found ways to nurture their bond. She sent handwritten letters, some intercepted, others miraculously reaching Sophie, filled with love, advice, and stories of their earlier, happier times. She encouraged her daughter's every curiosity about the world beyond the Riley estate, assuring her that courage and kindness mattered most. Every so often, Emily's phone would ring with Sophie's hesitant voice on the other end. Their conversations, brief and policed, were lifelines. Sophie confided fears about fitting in, about the expectations pressed upon her, about the invisible weight she felt at family dinners. Emily gently offered strength, never criticizing the Rileys directly, but equipping Sophie with wisdom and reassurance. You have every right to dream, to speak your truth, and to choose your own path. Slowly, Emily saw changes both in herself and in her daughter. Emily's confidence expanded. She carried herself not as a woman defeated, but as one in the process of becoming. Co-workers admired her discipline. Friends relied on her insight. Her growing reputation at the legal aid clinic led to better opportunities and the beginnings of a real career, one built on compassion, competence, and relentless effort. Meanwhile, Sophie learned to think independently. In her letters, Emily noticed flashes of wit, strength, and blossoming self-awareness, the kind that no amount of privilege or isolation could suppress. Despite, or perhaps because of, their forced distance, the mother-daughter bond endured, tempered and deepened by adversity. By the time Emily earned her first promotion, her apartment no longer felt like a stopping point, but a home. She celebrated modest victories, paying off a loan, receiving a heartfelt thank you from a client, passing an exam with top marks. She marked each milestone not only for herself, but as proof to Sophie and to the world that no amount of injustice could diminish their worth. In the quiet hours, Emily sometimes reflected on her journey, how the pain she once thought would break her had instead forged something unshakable. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, and that healing was not a straight line, but she was no longer defined by loss or shame. She was healing, rising, gathering strength for whatever battles might come. And above all, she remained determined she would be ready, the day her daughter needed her most. New schemes years slipped past in an uneasy truce. Emily Turner, now thriving as an attorney in a reputable New York law firm, had rebuilt her life stone by stone, an achievement both hard-fought and, in private, a constant reminder of what she had lost. Yet beneath the veneer of professional success and the fragile rhythms of her new world, Emily's heart never wandered far from her daughter. She had learned to wait, to persevere through the tightly monitored phone calls, the fleeting visits in sterile meeting rooms, and the small tokens of affection smuggled in and out of the Riley estate. Each contact, each whispered word of encouragement, strengthened her resolve to one day reclaim the place that had been denied to her not just in the eyes of the world, but in Sophie's life. Meanwhile, the world of the Rileys appeared unshakable from the outside, still insulated by wealth, tradition, and privilege. Their estate gleamed on magazine covers, their names surfaced at charity galas and on university buildings. Underneath this glittering facade, however, fissures quietly formed. Margaret Riley, the family matriarch, became even more commanding as the years wore on, obsessed with securing the family's legacy. David, Emily's ex-husband, had chosen compliance over conviction, long resigned to the machinery of expectations. Sophie, now a teenager, walked a tightrope between the imposed ideals of her family and the faint but powerful memories of her mother's warmth. She excelled in school, learned to smile on cue at society functions, and bore with grace the constant scrutiny of a family watching her every step. Yet there were nights when Sophie wondered if her ambitions were truly her own, or simply echoes of the plans scripted for her by others. Letters from Emily, sometimes intercepted or delayed, were cherished artifacts she hid under her mattress, drawing strength from her mother's stories of courage, empathy, and integrity. It was during one such autumn, as the leaves on the Riley estate turned gold and rust, that Margaret Riley unveiled her latest plan. A lucrative offer had been put forth by a powerful family from the West Coast, a proposed marriage between Sophie and their son, Oliver Lancaster. The match promised mergers in business, stronger political ties, and the preservation of old money values in a world Margaret saw as increasingly unpredictable. The idea was whispered in drawing rooms long before it became an open conversation, and by the time Sophie heard of it, most decisions had been made without her. Margaret presented it as a matter of family duty. To Sophie, it sounded like a sentence. She was 17, curious, opinionated, unsure of herself in the way young people are when the world expects certainty. She barely knew Oliver, who was 2 years older, and already chafing at the obligations of his own family lineage. There were dinners arranged, awkward formal gatherings where every word seemed rehearsed and laughter was scarce. Sophie did what she had learned over the years. She masked her discomfort, played the dutiful daughter, and waited for privacy to retreat into her journals and the letters from her mother. David's position was as passive as ever. He told Sophie he wanted her to be happy, but added, in a tired voice, that sometimes duty required sacrifice, a refrain Sophie had come to resent. Margaret, meanwhile, tightened her control, restricting Sophie's social circle, pushing her to drop extracurricular interests in order to prepare for a future befitting a Riley. The air in the mansion grew stifling. Gossip among the staff swirled about the impending engagement, and word began to leak to the local society pages. Emily, ever vigilant, picked up the first rumor from a former college friend whose sibling worked at a luxury hotel frequented by the Rileys. The news was vague, just a whisper about an imminent arrangement for Sophie. It was enough to set Emily's nerves on edge. She started watching more closely, leveraging her legal connections and the informal network she'd nurtured through years at the aid clinic and law firm. Calls were made, text messages sent, trail after digital trail followed through the maze of private event planners and discreet investigators. What emerged was a pattern. Sophie's social media profiles had gone silent. Her closest friends had either transferred schools or been pulled away. Mentions of the Lancasters began popping up in the society columns. Every sign pointed to the Rileys orchestrating Sophie's life with the same meticulous force they'd once used to exile Emily. Feeling powerless was not an option. Emily doubled down on her research, piecing together the timeline, digging into Oliver Lancaster's background, and researching the business merger that hinged on the marriage. She uncovered troubling financial reports, Lancaster family businesses, hiding debt, The Rileys facing lawsuits quietly settled out of the press. More disturbingly, anonymous posts began surfacing on gossip sites, hinting at Sophie's rebellious behavior at private parties. Though there was no real evidence attached, echoes of the scandal fabricated to destroy Emily years earlier. The parallels were chilling. Emily felt her anger burn hotter with each revelation. It seemed history was poised to repeat itself, this time with her daughter as the pawn. She wondered how deep the manipulation ran. Was someone laying the framework to discredit Sophie? Should she resist the marriage? Was a scandal being staged? Subtle enough to give the Rileys leverage, but damaging enough to trap Sophie in the role of a regretful heiress, obedient and silenced? Desperate for clarity, Emily reached out to Sophie, but her attempts at direct communication were stonewalled. Scheduled calls felt staged. Sophie's words clipped, a nervous edge in her voice. When Emily broached the rumor of an arranged marriage, Sophie hesitated, then whispered, "I don't want this, Mom. But they're not listening." The call ended abruptly. One evening, a torn envelope arrived at Emily's office. Inside was a note, written in Sophie's hurried, looping handwriting. "Something is wrong. They're watching everything. I feel like I'm being set up. Don't let them win this time." Emily's resolve crystallized. She knew, in the marrow of her bones, that the only way to protect Sophie was to shine a light into the darkest corners of the Riley machine. She started a new file, Project Homecoming, documenting every article, rumor, and legal transaction related to both families. She met with trusted former colleagues, quietly assembling a team from her past clients and contacts. Privacy experts, journalists, private investigators, anyone who could help her safeguard Sophie and unravel whatever scheme was tightening around her daughter. Sophie's life at the Riley estate grew tenser by the day. Trusted confidantes vanished. Conversations that once flowed freely with her grandmother's old housekeeper were suddenly cut short. Unsolicited gifts, like a new jewel-encrusted smartphone clearly monitored, arrived with gentle warnings. "Be careful what you say, dear. It's for your safety." Her diary disappeared one afternoon, only to be replaced by a pristine leather journal, empty but for a yellow sticky note. "Let's start fresh." The upcoming holiday, traditionally a time for family reflection and joy, loomed dark as the first event where Sophie and Oliver would be presented as a couple. As photographers circled the mansion's gates, Margaret rehearsed Sophie's responses to benign questions, reminding her that personal feelings are secondary to public duty. The pressure was suffocating. That night, Sophie slipped out onto the balcony, phone in hand, and typed a short email, encrypted and routed through every privacy app she had learned about from Emily's old computer tutorials. "Help me, Mom," she wrote. "Don't let them tell my story for me." On the other side of the city, Emily read those words under the blue light of her laptop, heart hammering against her ribs. She realized that the time for quiet endurance was over. The battle for Sophie was just beginning, and this time, Emily was prepared to fight for both justice and her daughter's freedom, no matter what it would cost. The return. The city was buzzing with the promise of autumn trees gilded in orange, sharp winds swirling through Manhattan's steel canyons, when Emily Turner decided she could wait no longer. Enough with strategizing from a distance, tracking rumors. From the shadows, soothing her daughter with clandestine messages. The time for caution was over. Sophie's urgent plea echoed in her mind day and night. "Don't let them tell my story for me." For years, Emily had watched, endured, rebuilt, and waited. Now, with her life at last her own, she was determined to reclaim what the Rileys had stolen. Her return was never meant to be subtle. Arriving at the Riley estate in a navy sedan, dressed in tailored navy with a lawyer's badge fastened at her hip, Emily radiated a different kind of power than the one the Rileys worshipped. She came armed not with threats, but with the confidence honed from 1,000 small victories, and the support of allies carefully assembled over the years. Doormen and staff, some new, others who remembered her as a discarded outsider, glanced uneasily, sensing the undercurrent of confrontation rippling beneath her calm exterior. She was no longer the insecure daughter-in-law, tiptoeing through marble halls and trying to shrink herself. Instead, she moved with purpose, her stride echoing off the polished floors as she requested an audience with Margaret and David Riley. The staff hesitated, old loyalties warring with new realities, before finally escorting her into one of the ornate parlors overlooking the gardens. Margaret Riley awaited her, as regal as ever, yet with faint tension pinching her perfectly composed features. David, grayer and more withdrawn, hovered near the fireplace, uncertainty writ large on his face. If either expected Emily to plead, they were quickly disabused. "I am here to see Sophie," Emily announced, her voice carrying certainty rather than supplication. Margaret's eyebrow arched, her words measured. "You must understand, Emily, that the family's reputation is not my concern," Emily interrupted. "Not anymore. Sophie is 17. She is entitled to her future and her truth. I am here not only as her mother, but as her legal advocate." Papers, notarized and meticulously prepared, emerged from her briefcase: requests for review of custodial arrangements, documentation of recent manipulations, and a formal challenge to the guardianship that had separated mother and daughter for far too long. David sputtered objections: tradition, duty, privacy. But Emily's resolve was unshakable. Her return was not a nostalgic homecoming. It was an intervention fueled by years of carefully documented injustice. "I am not here to negotiate away my daughter for business partnerships, or to tolerate another generation being silenced for your convenience," she said bluntly, locking eyes with Margaret. Behind the confrontation, Emily noticed the subtle choreography of the household staff, the way some lingered in doorways or exchanged glances. The Riley dynasty had always played its games in shadows, but news of her return, the exiled Turner, now a formidable attorney, traveled faster than whispers. Emily noted the apprehension, replacing arrogance, on Margaret's face, the steely calculation that so often preceded the Rileys' schemes. The real confrontation began when Sophie entered the room, the result of a tense summons relayed by an unsettled tutor. She had grown taller, more poised, her hair swept back, and her bearing defiant beneath layers of forced composure. For a moment, the air seemed to freeze as mother and daughter took each other in, Sophie trembling imperceptibly, Emily almost overcome but determined not to let emotion dull her mission. "Sophie," Emily greeted, keeping her tone steady, "I'd like to speak to you privately, please." Margaret protested, but Emily held her ground, referencing her legal authority and Sophie's rights. For the first time in years, the power dynamic shifted visibly. The house that once served as Emily's prison was now her courtroom. Their conversation, behind the heavy doors of a study, was raw and swift. Emily let Sophie talk without interruption about the suffocating control, lost friendships, the pressure of the impending engagement, and above all the terror that she might be publicly ruined, just as her mother once was. Emily showed her daughter the documentation, evidence that the marriage deal was about money and image, not love or happiness. Records of online chatter manipulated to frame Sophie as rebellious. At last, Sophie saw the pattern, history threatening to repeat itself in a cruel cycle. For the first time, Sophie's anger outweighed her fear. "I want out, Mom. I don't want to be like them," she confessed. Emily embraced her, promising, "You never will be, not as long as I'm fighting with you." It wasn't just inside the estate that Emily waged her battle. Utilizing her new status and a now impressive list of contacts, she orchestrated meetings with trusted media figures and quietly influential lawyers. She provided evidence, background, and context, not for the sake of tabloid sensation, but to ensure transparency and public scrutiny that would make any backroom deal far riskier for the Rileys to execute in secrecy. Soon, news spread beyond the insular circles of old money. The idea that the Rileys were arranging a marriage for their granddaughter's financial convenience, after years of having exiled her mother on fabricated charges, sparked outrage. Social media luminaries debated women's agency and class privilege. Journalists dug into corporate alliances. Friends who once felt powerless reached out, emboldened by Emily's example, offering bits of information, emotional support, or publicity when she needed it most. Meanwhile, every move Emily made at the estate was carefully choreographed for maximum effect. She insisted on Sophie's right to independent counsel and mental health support. She set conditions, supervised visits, protection from predatory press, open records of all agreements. When the Rileys tried to intimidate or isolate her, Emily responded with calm legal warnings. And with Sophie's testimony, she threatened to expose long-buried secrets in open court if pushed. The initial standoff transformed into a siege. Margaret, once implacable, began to flounder as social perception turned against her. David, incapable of handling the maelstrom, retreated further until his signature on household decisions became a formality. House staff, sensing the shift, became neutral or quietly helpful to Emily and Sophie, some even passing along word of Margaret's closed meetings or destroyed documents. Amid all this, Emily and Sophie grew closer. They snatched private moments, sharing plans for the future college applications, travel, restoring relationships long forbidden. Emily tried to balance fierce defense with moments of joy, knowing that simply surviving wasn't victory. Reclaiming hope was just as necessary. The bond between mother and daughter, once battered by distance and manipulation, deepened with honesty and mutual courage. By the time the first court date arrived to review Sophie's guardianship and the legitimacy of the arranged engagement, Emily stood at the estate's gates, not as a supplicant, but as a mother and fighter. The press assembled outside caught a glimpse not of scandal or defeat, but of a woman transformed by adversity and a daughter refusing to be written out of her own life. Emily knew they had not won yet. Powerful people rarely surrendered such narratives without a fight. But, for the first time since her exile, she felt the scales tip. The Rileys were on the defensive. Sophie's voice would be heard. And Emily, no longer an outcast, was home on her own terms. The battle in court and in public opinion. The first day of the legal battle arrived with an unseasonable chill sweeping through the city, as if the weather itself sensed the confrontation simmering behind the courthouse walls. Emily Turner, her nerves taut, but her heart resolute, squared her shoulders, and walked through the marble entry flanked not just by her legal team, but by friends, former colleagues, and observers determined to see justice finally play out in the open. Outside, a throng of cameras and reporters jostled for position, their questions ricocheting off the grand steps, none of which Emily acknowledged. This day, she reminded herself, was not for the press. It was for Sophie. Inside the courtroom, the dynamic felt electric, charged with both old resentments and new hope. The Rileys had assembled their customary army of high-priced lawyers, sleek, sharp-suited advocates, whose specialty was suppressing inconvenient truths. Margaret Riley sat at the family's table, icy and imperious, her gaze fixed straight ahead as if daring anyone to challenge her narrative. David Riley was more ambiguous, his discomfort barely masked behind formal politeness. He seemed to shrink further into the shadows of his own making. The presiding judge, aware of the case's implication and the media presence, made it clear from the outset that only facts would carry weight. This was no longer the world of whispered innuendo and backroom deals that had haunted Emily years before. Transparency would reign, and evidence was king. Emily's team moved swiftly, highlighting years of documentation and inconsistencies in the Rileys' guardianship. Her files were meticulous, a mosaic of bank statements, intercepted emails, social worker reports, and records of Sophie's suppressed correspondence. There were testimonies from former household staff, now emboldened to speak out after seeing the landscape shift. Some recounted subtle manipulations, calls cut short, letters hidden, restrictions placed without Sophie's knowledge or consent. A former nanny was particularly persuasive, detailing how she'd been instructed to monitor Sophie's every conversation and to report directly to Margaret. The Rileys' legal team counterattacked, painting Emily as an unreliable presence, a woman who had once abandoned her child under a cloud of scandal. Margaret's testimony was coldly precise, employing the rhetoric of tradition and family stability. She invoked the Rileys' century-long record of influence and civic engagement, hinting that any disruption in Sophie's upbringing would reverberate through philanthropic causes and local commerce. But Emily had anticipated these moves. One by one, she and her advocates debunked the accusations that had ruined her years ago. They offered digital forensics, proving that the photos at the center of her scandal were forged, and traced their origins to accounts that could be clearly linked to contractors employed by a Riley-controlled PR firm. When pressed about recently surfaced rumors of Sophie's rebellion, the evidence pointed to a similar strategy: anonymous posts originating from servers connected to acquaintances of Margaret's. That afternoon, Sophie took the stand at Emily's request. The courtroom grew still as she sat upright, visibly anxious but determined to have her say. She spoke of her life behind estate walls, describing the constant pressure to perform, to obey, to conform to expectations that were never her own. Through halting words and silent tears, she told of her desire for freedom, not just from an arranged marriage, but from a lifetime of carefully orchestrated roles. Her voice gained strength as she recalled the letters from her mother, describing them as lifelines, reminders of the courage and love that had been denied but never forgotten. "I want the right to choose my future," Sophie finished softly, her words echoing across the courtroom filled with strangers and family alike. "I want to know my story is my own." While the battle in court played out with legal precision, the battle outside was even fiercer and far less predictable. The press had picked up the scent of a dynasty in distress, but the narrative shifted away from salacious scandal to one of power versus justice. Articles appeared that highlighted the manipulations of wealthy families in shaping both their children's fates and public perceptions. Editorials took the Rileys to task for their old money hubris while celebrating Emily's grit and refusal to stay silent. Public support flooded in for Emily and Sophie. Hashtags trended as young women, survivors of similar experiences, and advocates for family law reform posted messages of solidarity. Former acquaintances who had once distanced themselves from Emily now reached out, apologizing for their silence and offering help. A few lawyers volunteered their expertise pro bono. Some of Emily's past clients, single mothers, immigrants, people she'd aided at the legal clinic, gave interviews attesting to her character and the gravity of her loss. Feeling the tide turn, the Rileys attempted a public relations counteroffensive. Press releases painted them as victims of sensationalism and the loss of private family deliberation. Margaret even appeared on a high-profile morning talk show, her tone dramatic as she lamented the painful fracturing of a beloved family unit. But the gambit backfired. Investigative reporters, already spurred by details surfacing in court, soon uncovered evidence of backroom deals, buried lawsuits, and the shadowy PR machinations at the heart of both Emily's old scandal and the current smears against Sophie. As days in court stretched to weeks, the courtroom became a crucible where both characters and reputations were remade. The Rileys' veneer of untouchable dignity slowly eroded under scrutiny, their claims crumbling as each piece of evidence fell into place. Margaret's authority over her granddaughter was cast not as protective stewardship, but as a form of emotional control verging on abuse. Even those sympathetic to the family's tradition began to question what price was worth paying for the preservation of legacy. Throughout the battle, Emily remained unyielding. Each testimony from Sophie, every document revealed, further steeled her determination. She refused to let the opposition bait her into anger or despair. Instead, she projected the quiet confidence of a woman who knew suffering, but who now had command over her narrative. When the press asked how she'd kept hoping for so many years, her answer was simple: mothers don't get to give up. At last, the closing arguments arrived. The Rileys' lawyers leaned on familiar tropes of tradition and the greater good, but the courtroom sensed a tectonic shift. Emily's closing reflection went beyond accusations and evidence. She spoke not only for her daughter, but for all those crushed by systems designed to preserve power at any cost. "We cannot use family as a shield to wound those within it," she declared. "And we cannot call ourselves just as long as truth can be bought off or buried." When court adjourned, the city outside felt changed. No verdict had yet been given, But the debates on talk shows and social media, the heartfelt letters sent to Sophie and Emily, and the newfound courage of the community all signaled that the Rileys' grip on the story, and perhaps on their legacy, had been broken. Inside, as Emily and Sophie stepped from the courthouse, cameras flashing and supporters waving, they knew the fight was not truly over. But for the first time, justice and their own voices felt within reach. The truth unveiled. In the weeks following the climactic court hearings, the city's attention remained riveted to the unfolding Turner versus Riley case. Speculation abounded in newsrooms, social media, and private drawing rooms alike. Yet, beneath the surface buzz, a much deeper drama was unraveling, one rooted not only in the law but also in the shifting loyalties and unspoken secrets of the Riley dynasty itself. The court had recessed, deliberate. Emily Turner, exhausted but relentless, chose not to rest. Knowing the Rileys' penchant for obfuscation, she and her legal team doggedly pressed for full disclosure, subpoenaing electronic records, personal communications, and security archives, previously sealed or hidden under layers of corporate privilege. The process, grueling and time-consuming, sent ripples of anxiety through the Riley estate. Tensions soared behind the mansion's brick walls. Margaret Riley maintained her icy calm in public, but in private, she was fraying. The staff, once silent out of fear or loyalty, now sensed the shifting winds outside and began to murmur their own suspicions. The pressure mounted on David Riley as well, whose passive compliance had reached its breaking point. Unable to ignore the obvious fractures in his family, and haunted by memories of happier days, he too began to question the narrative that had cast Emily as a villain and Sophie as a commodity. The turning point came unexpectedly, triggered by a careless oversight. While reviewing the retrieved communications from the Riley archives, Emily's paralegal, Marcus, found a string of old encrypted emails that had been marked for deletion but never fully wiped. These exchanged messages were between Margaret and a shadowy digital consulting firm, one notorious for crisis management and discreet information handling. As Emily pored over the correspondence, her hands trembled with the realization. The messages made explicit reference to manufacturing plausible visual evidence, containing marital repercussions, and ensuring the compliance of the press with new materials. Determined to confirm her suspicions, Emily enlisted digital forensics specialists, some of whom owed their livelihoods to her past work at the aid clinic. Their expertise paid off. The image manipulation trail, once buried in technical jargon and remote servers, became impossible to ignore. Metadata matched, digital fingerprints confirmed. The photos that had destroyed Emily's reputation and cost her custody had, in fact, never depicted reality. They had been staged and altered at the explicit request and payment of the Riley matriarch. News of the breakthrough hit the legal team with the force of a tidal wave. Emily, reeling with a mixture of vindication and anger, was determined to do what her enemies never expected. She would expose the treachery openly, without descending to their level of subterfuge. But as the evidence began to come to light in court filings, something even more seismic shook the Riley family. Sophie, who had endured months of legal battles with fortitude, was handed the unvarnished truth at last. Emily shared everything with her in a quiet room, laying out the documents, the timetables, and the names. At first, Sophie sat in stunned silence, her hands clenched so tightly they turned white. Then came the tears, for the childhood memories now tainted, for the years lost, for the trust so grievously betrayed. But her sadness gave swift way to resolve. The manipulations that had broken her family and twisted her own self-image would no longer be hidden. Sophie decided, of her own accord, that she would testify fully about her lived experience, about the unseen network of pressure, control, and gaslighting that had defined her adolescence. Meanwhile, the rest of the Riley family roiled in internal chaos. David, in particular, confronted Margaret in a rare, explosive family meeting. The confrontation shattered decades of protocol. He demanded answers why she had orchestrated the scandal, how she could sacrifice their granddaughter's happiness, and use Emily as a scapegoat, all for the sake of the family's image. For the first time, cracks appeared in Margaret's formidable composure. Her justifications, protecting the family legacy, shielding Sophie from doubtful influences, now rang hollow, even to those who had served her faithfully. Margaret's authority, unquestioned for so long, began to erode from within. Long-silenced relatives slowly stepped forward, emboldened by the changing winds outside and the courage shown by Emily and Sophie. Whispered stories of intimidation, bribery, and manipulation emerged, painting a portrait of a dynasty built on secrecy and coercion rather than respect. As Emily's legal team unveiled their findings to the judge, the force of the revelations stunned the room. Specialists testified to the forgery, while other witnesses' staff, who had once enforced Margaret's decrees, gave candid, often emotional accounts of the household atmosphere and the explicit directives they had received. Former friends of Sophie corroborated her isolation, recounting subtle but effective warnings to avoid unnecessary contact with her. The public, already sympathetic to Emily's cause, was now shocked by the extent of the Rileys' machinations. The case became national news, igniting debates over privilege, justice, and the hidden abuses of the wealthy. For the Rileys, there was no longer anywhere to hide. Sponsors and partners quietly backed away. Charity boards removed the family name from plaques and programs. Educational institutions reevaluated their relationships. Even loyal staff left, unwilling to be associated with a sinking ship. Inside the courtroom, the denouement was both legal and emotional. The presiding judge, compelled by the weight of evidence, ordered an immediate review of all Riley-related guardianship and custodial decisions. With the undeniable facts laid bare, Emily's innocence was publicly restored, her dignity and credibility returned in dramatic fashion. Rulings ordered a complete restoration of custody arrangements and the unsealing of records so that the falsehoods could be held up as a warning to others. For Sophie, the events of these weeks remade her sense of self. Standing in the witness box for her closing testimony, she spoke with newfound assurance, not just as a victim, but as a survivor. They wanted me to be silent, to inherit their story. But I have my own, and I have my mother back. The truth is what sets us free. As the world digested the reality of the Riley scandal, Sophie's words and Emily's courage became a rallying cry for others suffering under invisible power. The collapse of the Riley status inspired not schadenfreude in Emily, but a profound reflection. She and Sophie found comfort not in revenge, but in a restored bond, and in the community that had come to embrace them. At last, the truth was no longer someone else's weapon, but their shield. Emily walked out of the courthouse holding Sophie's hand, no longer as an outcast, but as the mother and person she had always longed to be. Redemption through success. In the aftermath of the courtroom reckoning, New York felt like a new world for Emily Turner and her daughter Sophie. The storm of scandal, long manufactured and manipulated by the Riley family, had finally rolled past, leaving behind not just the debris of a broken dynasty, but the seeds for a different, brighter future. The days and weeks that followed the verdict unfolded with a quiet intensity, each one reinforcing the powerful truth that true revenge, if it existed at all, was best pursued not by dwelling on the past, but by building a life so compelling that it silenced every false whisper. As the Riley name sank into infamy, Emily became a symbol in her own right. Publications that had once profited from her humiliation now sought her perspective on resilience, justice, and the strength of a mother's love. Emily approached these requests with humility, always careful not to let her newfound recognition become another mask. For every interview or profile, she redirected the spotlight, away from the sensational downfall of her former in-laws and toward advocacy for those mostly women, often parents still trapped in webs of power and manipulation. Her words carried weight, not because they attacked her enemies, but because they elevated the stories of others who had been forced into silence. Sophie, too, was forging her own path. Freed at last from the suffocating grip of expectation, she blossomed in ways both subtle and dramatic. At school, she volunteered for leadership roles in student government and the debate team, her natural empathy, honed through hardship, now earning her the trust of friends who admired her quiet confidence. She found herself gravitating toward creative pursuits as well, writing poetry, painting, and even dabbling in music, the voices that had tried to define her forever replaced by her own. For Emily, true healing meant throwing herself into her work, not just as a legal advocate, but as a force for systemic change. She returned to the legal aid clinic where she had first discovered her vocation, this time not as a student or intern, but as a mentor and key strategist. She spearheaded new initiatives, pro bono defense teams for falsely accused parents, educational seminars on digital privacy and reputation management, and even alliances with investigative journalists committed to exposing abuses by the elite. Doors opened that had once been slammed in her face. In her former life, the Riley surname had provided entry to exclusive circles. Now, it was her reputation for tenacity and compassion that drew support from partners old and new. Perhaps the most visible transformation unfolded in the very streets and neighborhoods where Emily and Sophie had once struggled to survive. The community that had once regarded them with uncertainty, some out of fear of the Rileys, others out of ignorance, had changed its tune. Local parents confided in Emily at school events, seeking advice or simply offering solidarity. Neighbors, once hesitant to get involved, dropped off casseroles, letters of encouragement, even art supplies for Sophie. The support felt honest and unforced. It was finally connection without strings. Meanwhile, the Riley family itself unraveled. The scandal had made headlines not only for the salaciousness of its original fabrications, but for the breathtaking scope of its cover-ups. Margaret Riley, once the matriarch of a social empire, faced a series of civil suits, while David was investigated for financial wrongdoing tied to fraudulent business deals exposed during discovery. Charities quietly withdrew their invitations. Corporate partners severed long-standing relationships. Properties were sold under the pretense of simplification, but word leaked that creditors circled ever closer. For all their money and social standing, the Rileys discovered that respect, once shattered, could not be bought back. None of this brought Emily glee, at least, not in the way one might expect. There was satisfaction, to be sure, in justice served. But Emily's primary emotion was a deep, long-delayed sense of validation. The world now knew the truth. Her innocence, her devotion to Sophie, and the ignoble tactics used to destroy her had all been aired in public. She had won not only in court, but in the arena of public conscience. There was nothing left to prove to anyone, not even to the ghosts of her past. The redemption of the Turners was not only public, but deeply private. Their modest apartment slowly transformed from a makeshift haven into a real home. Paintings Sophie created hung beside family photos that had once seemed too painful to display. Dinner conversations filled the rooms with laughter and debate, rather than the anxious silences of survival. They adopted a rescue dog, a scruffy black terrier named Lucky, whose energy seemed to mirror their own newfound optimism. Emily imposed on herself one rule. Her new chapter would not define itself by contrast to the Rileys' downfall. She rarely spoke to the media about her former in-laws except when asked directly. To current and future clients, her story was an example only insofar as it proved that injustice could be fought and that dignity sometimes survived only when one stopped waiting for an apology that would never come. Sophie, ever perceptive, adopted the same attitude in school and beyond. She refused to be known as just the girl from the scandal. Instead, she quietly let her actions, her kindness, hard work, and refusal to be cowed redefine her reputation. She excelled academically, qualifying for top university admissions. With her mother's encouragement, she applied for scholarships and leadership camps, no longer climbing to escape, but to fulfill her own dreams. As time passed, Emily was repeatedly invited to share her expertise at conferences and workshops, addressing digital privacy, reputation recovery, and legal protections for vulnerable parents. Each engagement was another opportunity to transform her story from an ordeal into a teaching moment. She hired from within her community, mentoring young women committed to advocacy and social change, helping create a ripple effect that would challenge the very structures that had once oppressed her. Their story also became a touchstone for wider discussions about privilege and power in American society. Journalists featured the Turners not as objects of pity, but as pioneers who had used truth and perseverance to reclaim their place. Even lawmakers took note. Emily lent her experience to a state bill increasing transparency in family court proceedings and protecting parents from malicious digital evidence. Still, some days were bittersweet. Memories of the Riley estate, its splendor, the quiet tragedy of its cold halls would resurface, tugging at both mother and daughter. But with each passing season, grief gave way to gratitude. The vibrant present, created from hard work and mutual support, proved more lasting than anything built on manipulation or inherited power. Emily's revenge, such as it was, had blossomed far beyond retribution. In the end, her greatest triumph was not the defeat of her enemies, but the full, unapologetic flourishing of herself and her daughter. Their success, public and private, announced to the world that dignity and truth were the ultimate vindication. And so, as one chapter closed and another began, Emily and Sophie stepped confidently into a future defined not by the harm done to them, but by the heights they chose to reach together: healing and forgiveness. For Emily Turner and Sophie, the world after their victory was filled with new light, but the shadows of the past, though fading, still lingered at the edges of their days. While legal triumph and public redemption had restored everything unjustly taken, the deeper wounds of betrayal, anger, and grief could not be mended by verdicts alone. Healing, Emily knew, was a journey of the heart. And the final chapter of their ordeal would require something even harder than fighting. It would demand forgiveness and the courage to reach for peace. For the first time since Sophie's childhood, mother and daughter began to construct a life without fear or secrecy. Their relationship, tested and tempered by years of struggle, gradually moved from survival mode to genuine trust and closeness. There were daily rituals, breakfasts in pajamas, cozy evenings spent reading or telling stories on the old couch, and long walks with Lucky, their irrepressible terrier. Tiny moments, all the more precious because they had once seemed impossible. Emily marveled at Sophie's resilience and gentleness. For her part, Sophie found strength in her mother's honesty and the safety of their bond. But outside the walls of their small apartment, the consequences of the Riley scandal continued to ripple through the city's elite. Margaret Riley's empire crumbled. Lawsuits, loss of status, and public shaming cast her into isolation. David, no longer shielded by his mother's will, faced his own reckoning first with the media, but more painfully, with himself. He had chosen silence, compliance, and self-preservation, allowing Margaret to orchestrate Emily and Sophie's suffering for years. As the dust settled and his name faded from society pages, he was left with only memories and regret. In the months following the court's decision, David summoned every scrap of humility he possessed. Tentatively, he wrote Sophie a letter, one that passed through Emily's hands before reaching its destination. In careful script, he apologized not with excuses, but with a father's genuine shame and sorrow. He admitted his failings and recounted the guilt that haunted him for abandoning her and her mother when they needed him most. More than anything else, he asked not for Sophie's forgiveness, but for the chance to someday be worthy of it. The letter sat on Sophie's desk for days, its existence a source of anxiety and reflection. Finally, one rainy afternoon, she read it aloud to Emily as tears welled in her eyes. To both of them, it was not absolution, but the first authentic gesture David had ever made. Sophie did not reply immediately. Instead, she let the pain speak, and then quiet, inside her before deciding what forgiveness should look like. Meanwhile, Margaret Riley's fortress of pride showed its first cracks in decades. Alone, cut off from influence and reputation, she faced a reality she had never imagined. When a package arrived at Emily's office containing an old photograph of Sophie as a child and a single page handwritten by Margaret, the message was stark yet unmistakable. I did great wrong, and only sorrow remains. I hope, with time, you and Sophie find what true family means. For a long time, Emily stared at the photograph and the faded ink. Margaret would never seek public or even personal reconciliation. Her nature was too rigid for that, but in her own cold way, she had acknowledged Emily's victory and Sophie's right to belonging. Emily's own feelings toward those who had wronged her were complicated. She spent many evenings reflecting on forgiveness. Was it an obligation or a gift? Could one ever really move forward without letting go? Ultimately, Emily realized that forgiveness was not a favor to her former in-laws. It was a release she offered herself and her daughter, a way to stop allowing old wounds to define the future. Gradually, doors that had been closed for years began to reopen. Sophie reached out to David, first with a cautious thank you for his letter, then through a series of honest conversations. They rebuilt, brick by brick, a tentative connection, one that would always bear scars, but that was now shaped more by understanding than anger. Emily did not shield Sophie from the complexity of this redemption. She encouraged dialogue, honesty, and above all, boundaries that Sophie could set for herself. For Emily, true healing meant more than forgiving her ex-husband and former mother-in-law. It meant forgiving herself, for choices she had doubted in the darkest years, for moments of rage or exhaustion, and for the countless nights she wondered if she had done enough to protect her child. The simple acts of self-acceptance allowing joy into her life again, celebrating her role in Sophie's resilience, and embracing new friendships were, at last, possible. Even for the extended Riley circle, whispers of transformation took root. Relatives who had stayed silent found their own reckoning. Some reached out to Emily to apologize or to thank her for breaking a cycle that would have bound another generation. Emily did not forget, but she no longer met these gestures with hostility. She responded only with the truth. Let's do better together or apart. Throughout the process, Emily and Sophie found meaning in giving back. They volunteered at organizations that supported women and families fractured by abuse of power. Sophie spoke at school assemblies about the importance of kindness and standing up for truth, even when it was costly. Emily helped establish a scholarship for students whose family circumstances mirrored her own. Each day, they found that the more they gave, the less room old bitterness held in their hearts. The truest symbol of their healing came one evening when, at Sophie's request, they visited Emily's parents in her quiet hometown. Years after gossip and shadow had divided the family, 3 generations sat beneath an old oak tree, sharing a meal and laughter, something they had not done since Sophie was a child. Forgiveness, Emily finally realized, was not an erasure of the past, but an acceptance that people could change, wounds could close, and love might root itself again even in scarred places. By the first anniversary of the court verdict, Emily found herself not merely surviving, but genuinely hopeful. She placed the old photo Margaret had sent in a frame beside new pictures of herself, Sophie, Lucky, and even, awkwardly, her former husband. In her heart, the chapter of revenge had faded. In its place grew gratitude for the pain that had led to growth, for the perseverance that had led to justice, and for the forgiveness that made a new life possible. As the seasons changed once more, Emily and Sophie stood stronger for everything they had endured and everything they had let go. They had discovered that, in the end, healing was the greatest victory and forgiveness, the gift only they could give. New beginnings. The city's skyline gleamed under the gentle light of spring, marking a new season for Emily Turner and her daughter, Sophie. A year had passed since the verdict that exposed the Riley family and restored Emily's honor, but more importantly, it allowed mother and daughter to step into a world neither thought possible in their darkest days. Where once their hope had been wrapped tightly around survival, now it stretched wide, eager for the uncharted future. After so many battles, life took on an unfamiliar, almost luxurious sense of calm. Emily woke each morning in their modest apartment, flooded with natural light, not to dread or despair but with a soft gratitude. The wounds left by betrayal and public shame were still visible, but no longer raw. Time, alongside their mindful efforts to heal, had turned them into scars of growth rather than signs of defeat. Sophie, now nearing her high school graduation, carried herself with newfound assurance. No longer haunted by the secrets and silence of her upbringing with the Rileys, she had flourished into a young woman whose voice resonated with compassion and conviction. Her art adorned their walls, a vivid testament to a spirit that, though battered, refused to be broken. Poetry notebooks lay scattered across the kitchen table, sharing space with scholarship offers and college acceptance packets. Decisions loomed, but for the first time, Sophie was not afraid to choose for herself. Their home radiated warmth, evidence of the freedom they had earned. Mornings were spent making breakfast together, laughing over burned pancakes or discussing headlines about world events and local changes. Lucky, their rambunctious terrier, begged for scraps and attention, the embodiment of the new life they'd built, ordinary, grounded, joyful. Emily's own work had deepened in meaning. She balanced a fulfilling legal career with community advocacy. No longer content to be a silent expert, she took an active role, mentoring young lawyers and counseling clients still fighting to reclaim their voices. The legal aid clinic, once a symbol of her second chance, had become her true professional home. There she fostered a culture of resilience and hope, ensuring clients received not just legal representation, but understanding the very lifeline she'd once needed herself. The community, too, had shifted. Where once neighbors whispered about the infamous court case and shied away from the Turner woman, now they greeted Emily and Sophie with friendly nods and conversations. Invitations to book clubs, potlucks, and local events arrived often and were gladly accepted when time allowed. At each gathering, Emily marveled quietly at the simple pleasure of belonging. On weekends, Emily and Sophie explored the city together. They visited museums, parks, and sometimes simply wandered, delighting in cafes and art fairs. These shared adventures were more than recreation. They were deliberate acts of joy, reclaiming time and opportunity previously lost. On one bright Saturday, sitting beneath cherry blossoms in a crowded park, Sophie confided, "I used to think happiness was just being left alone. But now I want to see where my life can go, instead of just running away from what hurt me." Emily understood. Her own journey echoed that sentiment. For so long, the Riley family's shadow had defined her world. Now, she measured her days not by what or whom she'd escaped, but by what she was shaping, one step, one relationship, one case at a time. As Sophie prepared for her next chapter, college in another city, perhaps another state, Emily supported her exploration without hesitation. There were open discussions about independence, boundaries, and the risks and wonders of a larger world. Emily confessed her fears, but she never let them harden into restrictions. She had spent too long fighting for freedom to deny it to her daughter now. The weeks before Sophie's departure were bittersweet, filled with planning and reflection. There were shopping trips for dorm essentials, calls with new roommates, and long nights talking about everything from heartbreak to ambition. On the eve of Sophie's move, the apartment was a patchwork of boxes, memories, and anticipation. Emily slipped a letter into Sophie's bag, a tradition begun when the world felt threatening, words meant to guide her daughter through uncertainty. This time, though, the letter brimmed with pride, encouragement, and a gentle reminder. "You are more than anything that's ever happened to you. The world is waiting. Claim it with kindness and courage." The day Sophie left for college, Emily felt the ache of emptiness, but also a fierce pride. They had done the impossible. Her tiny family had survived, healed, and now stood ready to thrive. To her surprise, a community of friends, not just old ones, but new faces as well, rallied around her in this transition. They offered invitations, support, and reassurance. Emily learned to accept help, to join spontaneous outings, and to find joy even in solitude. In the months that followed, Emily expanded her advocacy work. She spoke at legal conferences, sharing strategies for combating reputational abuse and digital manipulation. She worked on legislative campaigns to protect vulnerable parents and children caught in similar webs of deceit. She launched support workshops, pairing her legal expertise with hard-earned empathy, always reminding attendees that success was more than vindication. It was reclaiming hope and agency, no matter the opposition. Her reputation, once mangled by scandal, was now synonymous with perseverance and gentle strength. Journalists revisiting her story found a woman who refused to reduce herself to victimhood, who strove not for revenge but for restoration and impact. Emily remained measured, always shifting focus to the broader community's needs and pressing for justice that transcended her own history. Sophie thrived at college, sending emails and weekend calls filled with stories of new discoveries, challenges, and friendships. She became involved in student government and volunteer work, her past no longer a shackle, but a wellspring of empathy for others seeking their own new beginnings. Mother and daughter, now separated by miles, remained tethered by the same hard-won resilience that had brought them through crisis to transformation. As the first year of Sophie's independence wound to a close, Emily reflected on their journey. She recognized that deliverance didn't mean erasing scars, but rather finding purpose and beauty in spite of them. New beginnings, she realized, were not clean slates, they were mosaics, pieced lovingly from fragments of pain and joy, loss and growth. One evening, hosting a small dinner with friends and supporters, Emily raised her glass to toast the future. To all who have lost and begun again, we are not defined by what was taken, but by what we choose to build. And so their story unfolded not as an ending, but as a continuum. Emily and Sophie remained living proof that hope, nurtured through adversity, could not just heal, but inspire a stronger, richer life. Each day brought a fresh horizon, new cases, new friendships, new ways to give back. After hardship, their greatest act of defiance and triumph, in the end, was simple and profound: the courage to begin anew.